No mai haere mai. Welcome to Climate Kōrero, brought to you by Climate Action Tai Tokoro, the podcast where we dive deep into the challenges, obstacles, and perspectives shaping our changing climate. Join us as we explore how communities across Tai Tokoro, Aotearoa, and beyond are adapting, growing, and finding strength in the face of our changing climate. From local heroes to global movements, we kōrero with those on the front lines of sustainability, innovation, and resilience. Whether you're a climate advocate or just curious about the world around you, there's a place for you in our conversation. So grab a cuppa, settle in, let's talk climate.
Joining us is a very special guest, Richard Catherall, a man that I met through Social Enterprise Auckland. And I had a very awesome opportunity to talk about a social enterprise that I began, which was called Crescendo, which led to Crescendo Entertainment Group. And that was all around podcasting, audiobooks, but more essentially using those tools to create pathways for youth. And then Richard spoke after me, and I decided that I needed this friendship in my life. The man is amazing. He's done some really impressive work both here and overseas. And we're going to unpack a lot of it, and I guess introduce the world to a lot of these amazing things that you've done. So thank you so much for this. If you can just kind of a bit of whanaungatanga, I guess describe your background, what you've done internationally, how you ended up in New Zealand, all this. What I've heard so far and what I'd like to hear more of has been very exciting. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Called Richard Catherall, toko whenua. Originally from Lancashire, in the northwest of the UK, and worked in England after university in social enterprise and local government there. I really needed and wanted to work alongside people like you in harder places.
Yes.
So one of the biggest frustrations in the UK was people would complain about there not being enough money. And a lot of the discussion was about money, but there was no shortage of money.
Right.
The conversation needed to shift to values and principles and perhaps take more into more account of things over a longer period of time. That's not very natural there. So I wanted to work where people were more comfortable tackling more complex issues over a longer period of time, and worked for a decade with younger socially entrepreneurial people. And I just want to acknowledge a lot of young people choose entrepreneurship and they give their best years of their life to really meaningful challenges. Doesn't mean they'll be a success, or that's not a judgment. I just want to acknowledge that those people are giving the best years of their life.
Yeah.
And I think that is that carries a lot of weight with me. So I took that very seriously, working alongside those people and developing coaching-based practice. So using a coaching-based approach, strength-based approaches to enable them to access technical support, financial support, other supports for their entrepreneurial development and learning. But it was coaching-based to keep them in the driving seat,
Right.
to partner with them, build a relationship with them, to approach system change, as a professional friend, critical friend at times, but a non-traditional, non-academic form of capability building, or it was very much leaving them in the driving seat, and so learning as much from them as you were learning, you were helping them learn, and so I worked in predominantly the Euro-Mediterranean region, so North Africa and what is known as the Middle East in the Western narrative, but the Levant and Southern Europe, places where there's a lot of human culture, a lot of history, a lot of civilizations, but it is still a hard place to be entrepreneurial, to do business, a lot of different power plays. And I was introduced in that area to the climate changing and its effects, and in particular how equitable that transition would be.
Right.
You know, who would seize an advantage, who had the power, who had the privilege, and who didn't. I think within a very short period of time, a lot of things that are grown in the Mediterranean to eat, food and food culture being so important there, just won't be able to be grown.
Right.
Because of climate change.
Yeah.
So, you know, everybody will feel the effects, but not necessarily have the agency or the power to do much about it. So it was an inescapable learning for me. And I'd like to admit and apologize, because it was one of the aspects of being born with a Western worldview and in a Western system, just how ignorant you could be of the environment and climate. So if in social enterprise in the UK or America, or you'll regularly hear people say people and planet. It is intentionally separated, people and planet. And so I have to admit that, you know, in the first 10 years of working with social enterprise, the organizations that were dealing with green issues and the environment were actually in the minority. The vast majority were looking at social and human issues with no intentional connection to the environment. And I remember setting up a business with an older social entrepreneur who specifically asked us not to focus on environmental causes. And I agreed with him at the time. I was like, okay, let's not do that. So I was a really late comer to this massive blind spot of there is no separation. It's manufactured. And so obviously an indigenous worldview never makes that separation.
Yeah.
Ever. So it was never separate here. So it's really a privilege to be here where it's so natural to have those reconnected. But also when you step out of the Western world, you realize that is a completely manufactured separation. Yeah. And that's another benefit of working with entrepreneurs in that part of the world, was that they were much more holistic in their approaches to social enterprise and social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship in general had a wider theory of value than just making money, and it was certainly much less detached from place, and regardless of whether it was in an urban or a rural environment. And so as that dawned on me, that's when I realized that I was in a privileged and powerful position, but actually this was an area I just knew nothing about. And so that was really humbling. And I remember a number of times when there were just real wake-up calls that this was something extremely powerful that I was ignoring, and maybe my partners were ignoring, but it was going to have the potential to set back things that we cared about, missions that we prioritized, you know, fundamentally. So now I would say that, you know, I'm one of those kind of reluctant environmentalists in that, you know, I bring no expertise to the table, but I do really respect that we've really called this one wrong, and that we all have a real duty to try and reestablish this connection if we've broken it, and to take lead from people that never broke it in the first place.
What a fantastic opportunity for you
so.
to make those learning observations.
Yeah.
And apply it everywhere else that you go. I also heard you talking about the relationship being reciprocal. I find the mentoring relationship, you're getting as much out of that person that you're mentoring as they are getting from you.
Yeah.
So it has to be reciprocal, which kind of feels like what you were describing in terms of connection to the whenua. Kaitiakitanga is all about that. You are part of it. You are guardian. And then Moriora being that breathing life into all various things. Can you tell us a bit more about, I heard you speak about things changing so dramatically in that climate or in that arena that there was no adaptation that could happen. There was, obviously people could see a problem coming. What were they trying to do to adapt?
So I think one of the gifts, privileges of working in really difficult places where you saw the extremes. So these extremes were like glimpses of utopia or the future now.
Yeah.
So even though they were very negative, they were gifts because they were like a little window on what might happen if we don't adapt or change the way that we work. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Bangladesh, I was supporting a team that was using, they wanted to make native crops stronger. And they wanted to detach themselves from dependencies on foreign imported fertilizers and pesticides. Now, the irony of why they were focusing on that was originally a piece of work they did when they were younger about why are there a disproportionately large number of young women in Bangladesh that are blind. And over 60% of the farming workforce in Bangladesh are women. And because of the practices, they use a lot of water. So a lot of the women in the field will be up to their ankles or knees in water. And as they work, they will reach down and wash their eyes with the water.
Interesting.
Which will be carrying a also disproportionately large amount of chemicals because of the dependency on fertilizers and pesticides.
Right.
So there is a causal link between the pollution that's imported in these Western approaches to agriculture clashing with a local approach to agriculture, which is disproportionately exposing women to a risk that they're not even aware of, that then leads to them going blind. And you have this other issue. So getting upstream for these entrepreneurs was how do you get that fertilizer and pesticides out of the water? Because you don't want to you don't use them, and you don't want to sort of focus on what the other Western models will be about educating the young women to do it differently or change the approach to farming. That is in their DNA. That should be protected. What we need to get out of the system is the foreign import. And so this family unit had put a lot of time and effort into understanding tissue culture-based approaches to creating much more virus and disease-tolerant plants. And these approaches took a long time. They weren't as commercially viable as those that rely on pesticides and fertilizers.
How long ago was this?
This was between 2014 to 2020.
Okay.
And anyway, cut a long story short, we were then looking to scale up their approaches to producing disease-tolerant, virus-tolerant potatoes and other staple crops. And we were putting in an investment proposition to be able to acquire more land, to be able to do it at scale. And it was the investors that actually gave this very useful feedback to say, you haven't taken into account climate change. And their data showed that the seasons had started to move over the last decade, and that our plan for growing and scaling was going to also expose us to more impact of climate change, and that basically the bigger we got, our predictions, our ability to anticipate and forecast profits and losses and costs would get less and less reliable. And so on that basis, they were not going to grant us investment.
Right.
And this was really useful feedback because it wasn't a useless no. It was we were talking about this before, it was pinpointing that what they were saying is that this approach to growing crops is basically going out of business. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a solution to one problem. The climate change is going to mean that certain solutions no longer work. Yeah. And so we typically entrepreneurial and young, decided to try and bootstrap it a different way. And what that did was actually expose us to exactly what the investors were showing. So we did work with a group of farmers. We did plant. We used our own money. We borrowed money. We lost 2 years worth of effort and crops because the season wasn't predictable. It moved.
Oh, fascinating.
And
the whole world's going through that now.
Yeah, the whole world is going through that, and certain areas of the world are going through it. And it's challenging fundamental models of food production and ways of life, so that the people that have passed that knowledge on from generation to generation are now hitting a brick wall of what hasn't been passed on is how to get around this issue. So that was one example of people actually thinking the solution was to think big, be ambitious, get in foreign investment, apply technology, but then realizing that climate change was going to outpace you.
Yeah.
The other example is actually from Gaza, and I was doing a piece of work in Gaza and had the opportunity. That's how I was introduced to circular economy through Gaza, and Gaza is, for all the wrong reasons, a circular economy because there's a wall around it and a limitation in the sea. So there is an incentive to create economies which can exist within those confines. And so you see some fantastic circular economy systems at work there. And the alternative, of course, is waste going to landfill. And this was an opportunity to step out of the project that we were on and join the same group of experts from the university to actually go and challenge an EU delegation which was funding the last landfill in Gaza, because there was a limited amount of space. And what they wanted to challenge was to do a landfill site to EU standards. You finish it off with topsoil and grass, so it looks like a green hill. And the scientists and the farmers and the entrepreneurs were all on the same page saying, but there's only a certain amount of topsoil left in Gaza. And so we would like to retain that for food production. Is there any way that we can do this landfill without topping it off with grass? And the EU, using its power, and it was like, no, it has to be done this way. It's our money, it's our design, it has to be safe, it has to be, for all good reasons. But they weren't listening to the trade-off that would mean. You'd end up with a safe landfill site which would solve a problem. It wouldn't blow up and it would absorb a lot of waste. They weren't listening to the local people saying, yes, but the trade-off is that we will have significantly less topsoil to grow food, and that's pretty important. That's about food sovereignty. But also, because of climate change, where you've got wind erosion and, we're not getting upstream on actually the consequences of losing our food production and that sort of thing, and that we're offering you the opportunity to invest in the circular economy, which would divert waste from landfill.
Yeah.
But because of the way that power structures are set, the innovation of the local community wasn't being heard, which was actually much more in tune with climate change and adaptation. So the two lessons I take from that are a lot of it's shocking actually that we're not all getting these little wake-up calls to sort of shake us to the core, like the teams out there in Bangladesh that were actually realizing it didn't matter that they had a new idea. Climate change was a real force and it was going to change things. So that's one lesson, is a lot of people in power and influence are just they just don't believe that the change is going to be as significant as it will be, perhaps because they don't have that direct exposure to it, because they're in their little bubble, or they'll be able to protect themselves. So they're not seeing it for what it is. And then the other message that I've got is that those that actually have been adapting to this for some time are not being listened to or empowered, with investment to actually bring the solutions forward. And I think that they are two real issues that we're grappling with. You can have a solution, but it might not actually be at a scale that's going to tackle climate change, and it requires government action or major sector action. Or you may actually be onto something and people just aren't listening to you because they're focused on something else.
The investor that had the foresight to ask those questions?
Ironically, they were an investment firm that was set up post-colonial period of Britain. So they were the Commonwealth Development Bank, and I think it's now called British Investment.
Right.
And the reason why they could provide that feedback is in a very traditional bureaucratic way. They just recorded every investment that they'd ever made in every place that used to be part of the empire, and what happened as a result. Was it a success? Was it a failure? When a war happened, what was the impact? They have this amazing data set, and so they were able to compare and contrast with, we know that climate is going to have an impact because we've been watching things change over all this time. We know if you're in an area where there's a war, we know what the impact will be, and so they were using that to make their investment decisions.
Curious.
And there are so few investors that have been around that long and have kept that data that they could use it for good and share that information with the right people. So, kudos for them. But quite often, investors are quite closed with their information because they see it being, commercially sensitive.
Yeah, but the amount of value that
there's huge value in it because there's so few data sources that are over that period of time that you can actually, work out what's going to happen and, what's on the way out and what should we protect.
Man, what an awesome resource to have. Like the consortium model right there, the networks that they have, the shared value that they could be sharing with all the other like-minded.
I think mana whenua have that knowledge as well here. And how is it listened to? How is it used to make decisions?
Yeah.
How is it respected as, you have watched the whenua change over hundreds of years. You've seen what happens after cyclones and volcanic eruptions and how long it takes for things to recover. And, that now has a value, but it's not yet being valued as highly as it should. But it's there.
Yeah.
It's not like we have to go to some, top-of-the-range Western university and throw millions of dollars at it to come up with an idea. It's there. We just have to respect it differently. And that they're the things that have to change first, I think. From those two examples, people share the information that they've got, give people the right feedback, so we right-size things, but also recognise that maybe we're trading off the wrong things and we need to work out what we need to protect.
Wouldn't it be fascinating if all iwi hapu kind of had that map? I think about one of the local farmers he's a biodynamic farmer, and when we were developing our permaculture site, the advice that he was bringing to the table was like, okay, so what's in the environment? You're in a gully. What kind of soil is in there? His 20-odd years of experience looked at the land from a more helicopter view and a more holistic approach. He'd say to us when he goes into a new area, he's driving in and looking at the trees and understanding, okay, that's what's in the soil. Yeah. That's what's in the water. Like, he can see it just from the colour and what type of trees are there. Going back to mana whenua and those networks and the data sets, just imagine what could be achieved if they're all connected.
I definitely think that's one of the motivating factors for my partner and I. I mean, yes, we did choose to come here. We were also invited here. But when we were looking at places to go, it was where are the places in the earth that will actually get the opportunity to protect things? That's not a given for everybody.
Yeah, right.
We take that for granted, that you're going to have enough time, enough resource, enough insight to protect what's important to you. You might not even know what's important to you. You might have lost it by the time you work that out. But that's what climate change, I think, actually is. That's its biggest challenge, is that by the time you get it and you see the impact of it, there's no guarantee that you'll actually have enough left in reserve to protect something. So adaptation or mitigation is one thing, but there are certain things that actually are really important to us. And again, when you work in conflict zones or harder places, people have learnt that the hard way. Things that they really have been protecting for maybe thousands of years, they get bombed in a moment and they're gone.
Yeah, right.
And when we talk about cultural displacement, that's the most extreme version of people really being attached to those things and understanding their importance, and then the conflict being this thing that you just can't protect what's important anymore. And climate change, sadly, is on the same sort of scale. So that's one of, I think, the Aotearoa's comparative advantages, to use a commercial frame, is that we will still be able to protect what's important. That's really an amazing privilege. I hope that we see it as that and actually take the opportunity to protect some stuff, rather than just use that advantage to do the least, do it cheapest, make it easiest, which is the alternative.
So I'm just bringing up on the screen here one of the social enterprises that you've worked with in Nigeria. I want to speak in particular about this guy. I guess working in the different environments around the world. This particular article stood out as an opportunity, I imagine, an opportunity for you to make some really cool discoveries. And I guess I'm searching for, what did you learn from this experience? What are you still continuing to learn? And what can you relate back to New Zealand?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I've had to reflect on most working with people like Emmanuel in harder places was, ironically, the more successful an entrepreneurial person was, potentially the greater personal risk they expose themselves to. So like the complete opposite, perhaps, of this kind of Western celebrity view of entrepreneurs, that success brings great rewards and plaudits. In a harder place, an entrepreneur is someone that is going to show up on radar differently. You know, the norm would be to keep your head down, collude with the system, take what's given to you. So social entrepreneurship in these places is quite a revolutionary thing to do. Okay. It's a very disruptive thing to do. And you'll be exposed to significant moral and ethical dilemmas on an almost daily basis, because, you know, these places can have corrupt practices and cultures. They can have limited legal protections for things that we take for granted, and lots more rent seeking. So people trying to extract their income, their profit from other people's efforts. You know.
So the success from this venture creates people saying, "Hey, no, this is what you owe me because you."
Absolutely. People want their share of the coin. So in the West Bank, for example, I remember this being a really powerful conversation with an entrepreneur who we were discussing whether we should actually reverse the social entrepreneurship journey that we'd started, because it was so successful. Successful at empowering young people that previously felt very disempowered. Creating a platform for people to advocate for themselves and their collective determination, and the attention that would attract from the authorities. You know, the success of being more financially stable means that you are less dependent on quite powerful players like funders.
Shouldn't that be the objective?
I know it should be the objective, and it quite often is the objective. But when it's a success, then people really have to put their money where their mouth is. So, you know, people will, and that's what I mean. So, without wanting to be too ethereal, that success and that ability to break from the norm, to lead, to build your own networks, it goes against the system. You know, you are clearly an agent of change. You are clearly someone that wants to change the system, and in those environments, that's seen as revolutionary activity. And quite often, people have an incentive to stop that happening. So you will. Some things that have happened to Emmanuel, I can't share here because I don't have his permission, but they would shock you to the core as a father, that somebody would do that to a father because they perceive that he has got something that they deserve a share from.
Oh, bro. Yeah, I think I'm getting the picture.
So
you were mentioning funders before, so
yeah,
I was kind of going, how does that work?
yeah, but I mean, so Emmanuel is special for not to insult him, but he's special because he decided very early on that it was his calling to take the roll with those punches. He saw he was originally attracted to the priesthood. His faith was very strong. He thought that his contribution as a role model, as a leader, would be as a faith leader. But then he sort of summed it up to me as, but then I realized that, changing the world is more than just Sunday. It's a day job.
Yeah.
And that the priesthood didn't offer him enough traction for the rest of the week. So he moved into education as a space that is interacting with people on a daily basis, has got much more scope for influencing and impacting upon people's lives, and in particular young people, and being that kind of ethical role model to influence them to be the leaders that the country actually needs in the future. So he was originally set up an NGO. That's what all the advice was. Set up something charitable, apply for grants, ask for donations. And I met him on a program that I was running for the United Nations, which introduced social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. I actually, as a sustainability strategy for NGOs and youth projects, because those programs will always say, we can't fund them every year. We've got to do something to stop them being dependent. So they're fully aware that the way that they work creates dependency. And the reason why that program was successful, but also itself disruptive, was that's where it started, was helping people identify what their dependencies were and whether those dependencies were sustainable, rather than let's do social enterprise to generate some more money. It was more, what are you trying to change here? What's your mission? Yeah. How long is that going to take? How strong do you need to be? How resilient do you need to be to achieve that? What kind of relationships do you need? And therefore, let's clear out these other dependencies so that you can concentrate on that. So it was...
How do you even answer those things?
It was a real call to action for people that were coming to the program from sub-Saharan Africa, from Southeast Asia, from South America, who were like, this is different. You're actually respecting that we are leaders, that we've been applying for this funding and using this funding because we didn't think there was an alternative. But actually, if there is an alternative that enables us to create more opportunities for local leadership, for strength-based approaches, for more genuine collaboration, then we're interested in. And that was their motivation for Explore Social Entrepreneurship. So with Emmanuel, we started to work together in 2014, and we agreed that we would invest in each other through coaching and mentoring, specifically to transition his primary and secondary schools from a donor-funded model, where the education was free, to a social enterprise model, where the education was affordable. And that included not just charging people. It included...
So it was subsidised?
It was... by 2017-18, it wasn't subsidised. The school could actually make a small profit from charging for the education.
Okay.
But in order to do that, the school had to change from being what we would expect to be just a school that provides education to an institution that was really, really grounded in place and into the sustainable development of that community.
So what's the mechanics behind it?
So the reason why Emmanuel had decided to focus on creating these primary and secondary schools was because of the displacement caused by climate change and the conflict that comes with that around the northern part of Nigeria. So a lot of indigenous tribes live around Lake Chad, which is shrinking, which affects fishing, affects agriculture. That has stimulated far more nomadic farming. So those farmers that actually raise livestock have to move their cattle more. Violent groups will pay those farmers to basically use their cattle to trample other tribes' lands that are arable, creating
Okay.
conflict between tribes. And so it can be intertwined. Climate change can be intertwined into sources of conflict. And eventually, as we've discussed, when food systems collapse, then people will be displaced. And therefore the cultural displacement will come and everything else. So that this area of Nigeria, people will, as they would even in Aotearoa, would identify an urban centre as a place to start again and having more advantages. So you've got a large number of people moving across the country. And in this part of Jos, which is right in the middle of Nigeria, there are 75 different ethnic groups that have sort of landed in an area and are trying to start again. And so Emmanuel's vision was, instead of building a church, which would traditionally have been in the middle of a village, we'll build a school. And the parents can start the healing process and can start to think intergenerationally again through their involvement in the school. The school becomes an investment, that their children are not, they don't have to inherit the trauma of the displacement. They can actually reset through school. So
What a mission.
the mission of this community is to, reset, rebuild, grow, and that is the educational curriculum.
Well, with 75 different ethnicities
Yeah.
comes a multitude of religious beliefs.
Beliefs,
socioeconomic.
of social issues. So that's where, in an NGO donor-funded model, that was kind of kept to the side as an issue. But in a social entrepreneurship model, that became so how do you form a governance structure that is interfaith, intercultural, that is representative
Right.
of the community,
Yeah.
and partner with a faculty of teachers. So this school is more than just a school. So I think that's one of his breakthroughs in that period of time, was actually the shift towards social entrepreneurship, and this thing being a collective investment, the school, the collective investment, future education of their children, created lots of opportunities for parents to get involved in the school's development and their children's development. And so it's got very strong governance. And as an example of that, the police and army use the school and its capital, its cultural capital through its governance, for alternative dispute resolution. So if children and young people have been approached by armed groups, or they have perhaps committed some crimes, instead of them being arrested and then being lost to society, this school has got the reputation that, can you take this child back? Can you actually can the village come and wrap around this child again and give us an alternative dispute resolution here, because we respect what this school is and what it's part of, and that sort of thing. So that's just an example of, before COVID, the police or army using the school several times. And that was a real signal. And Emmanuel, recognized that as well, was that it was more than just about making some money and becoming financially sustainable. It meant that you had to look at all aspects of the model.
Yep.
And distribute power very differently, which is what this article is about, is that social entrepreneurship and is often about power shift in system change. And so,
what are the age group of the young people that attend?
So I think that we're looking at the primary schools starting at 3 or 4 years old, and then going all the way through to 14, 15 years old. And this school achieves very, very well.
I can't even imagine what goes on in places like Nigeria. You're saying armed?
Yeah, armed groups, terrorism, war, dysfunctional government, corruption. It is a place that is, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, wow.
And the only thing and this is Emmanuel's mission, the only thing that's going to change that is if the leadership changes, and if that's distributed. There's no point having one leader that you expect everyone else to follow them. You need that leadership, those values, those principles, that commitment to the environment, commitment to each other, the understanding of community, to be really, really distributed. And that's what the power of schools can be, if they can inculcate that into the next generation of young people. But you can't teach that just in a classroom. So that's where the problems or the challenges of building a new part of the city are pulled into the classroom. You know, that is part of the curriculum. People are learning about science and maths and literacy by solving social issues through their, and also with older students mentoring and coaching younger students.
Oh, cool.
So there are entrepreneurial, by the time they've got to 14 or 15 years old, there are entrepreneurial projects. And what we discovered from that is that that was often enough that if a young person had actually been very involved in a local issue, they had a huge incentive to not travel 100 miles away to university. They wanted to stay. They wanted to build a business around it. They wanted to volunteer around it. They wanted to solve that problem long term. And that's where the demand arose for the third level of school, the polytechnic, something that would be grounded in place, that would mean that the education system didn't inadvertently displace young people just so they could go and get a degree because of the perceived better job they were going to get with a Western-style degree. Once you've spent 3 or 4 years in Lagos, hundreds of miles away from rural Nigeria, the connection is largely broken. And so the community wanted to come up with an alternative that some of their children wouldn't be displaced at 15 or 16, and that again would create this mutually reinforcing effect of young entrepreneurial young people wanting to build the next stage of the city, which is potentially a model which could be replicable in other parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa. And that's Emmanuel's mission.
So I'm hearing that the kaupapa and culture of this institution is so strong that they've retained the buy-in of these young people, so they're not going out there wanting to put back in. What's the model of practice that he's using that creates all that? Well,
it's a range. I mean, that's the other thing that I really respect about him is his respect for multidisciplinary approaches. So he's woven in social entrepreneurship. He's woven in indigenous worldviews. He's woven in interfaith work, peace and conflict resolution methodologies, the type of things that each would be individual projects in the international development world have been woven into a curriculum and a teaching environment, an educational environment. So, I mean, the whole faculty is also very young and is thirsty for anything that has the potential to work, can be adapted and woven. And it also creates the space and the openness for those indigenous worldviews or capacities that, from thousands of miles away to find a place and a new application. So, older people in the community are also part of the education. So it's as much as possible, it although it tries to achieve international standards and it can achieve national standards, it's much more holistic as to the school is more than just educating people and getting exams. It is about the intergenerational impact that it can have. And if it's so plugged into the overall development of the place, then that's really mutually reinforcing and is pulling the school through its faculty, through its teachers, through its parents, through its students, into other areas of development in the area.
Awesome.
I don't know many schools. Many schools would want to be like that.
Yeah.
But there are good examples, in South Auckland. Manuera High School has a similar commitment to being that woven into its local community, and this kind of more circular engagement of the challenges that you face outside of school can be dealt with at school, and got a really good focus on innovation and supporting leadership. So I do think it is a model that all schools can adopt. But in the olden sort of approach, I suppose school was all about uniform, and you wrapped something around the child, and you did a lot to detach them from where they were from or what was on the other side of the gates. People would send their children hundreds of miles for that education because it prepared them for the future.
Yeah.
But what happens if there is potentially a future just on the other side of the gate? You don't want that complete separation. So, and that's, again, going back to Emmanuel's faith background, churches used to also be much more woven into their community. And so he has kept that bit alive. Obviously he couldn't do a church and expect all these different religious groups to convert.
Yeah.
So he won't go that far, but the school allows that melting pot. We have, through this work, we worked in Sierra Leone, we worked in Rwanda, and we found there were a number of entrepreneurial educators, probably principals of schools, who wanted support to take their school to this next level. They were not going to be able to do it through the national ministry. They certainly weren't getting supported to do it by the international aid system, which often puts in alternative education, that's very Western or, to that higher standard.
Yep.
So, Emmanuel wants to be able to share this kaupapa, this approach, with other entrepreneurial teachers in a network.
So the community carried a lot of that weight. And
yeah,
pushed
it did.
over the
And
line.
then obviously that was really tested during the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, schools were closed. The school very quickly turned itself over to food production. So people did not go without food. The school just became a food growing area and distribution. And it swapped to being, a form of using that community organising capability that it had built. It was deployed to the pandemic effort. And that is also when we decided to take a really big risk and invest a lot of our own money in building the Polytechnic,
Right.
in the hope that it would be ready for when the pandemic was over to help the community recover, which turned out to be financially a huge risk because of the regulation and bureaucracy that we're still wading through. But the intention was good, and it was also, that's what I'm saying, that's what put Emmanuel then at more risk, because to other people, they could see that he clearly had a source of capital at a time when everyone was getting quite desperate. So that was a miscalculation on our part, that we wanted to do something very positive. We wanted to demonstrate that that we should invest now because we were going to recover from the pandemic, that it wasn't the end. But it had unintended consequences.
Wow.
So, but Emmanuel, again, it goes back to my point about giving the best years of your life to something, because, originally Emmanuel will have developed this through youth support programming, youth funding, youth projects. He's now pushing 50.
Yeah.
And you know what it's like to be a social entrepreneur. He hasn't done much thinking about retirement. Hasn't been doing much thinking about his own intergenerational
Well, how many years
wealth.
has he been doing it?
I think like 20, 25 years. And in the concept of everybody asking you for a 12-month project or maybe a 3-year time frame. So that they've, in effect, I'm not saying they did it intentionally, but they've burned his youth. That's what I'm trying to shine a light on. If you're giving your best years of your life to someone, people should recognize that and actually be there to say, this is going to get easier. I'm going to use my funding, I'm going to use my influence to make this easier for you. You shouldn't be still trying to do something that you were doing in your 20s when you're in your 50s. And we always used to laugh about that. If you do youth work in sub-Saharan Africa, quite often you look around the room and think, this is not a very young crowd.
Yeah.
But it's because everybody thinks that youth work is easy and it attracts funding. But if it's not truly effective, it's the only funding available in the area, and so everyone in the room will be 50, crowding out the young people. So
it's more like the thriving communities and self-sustainable humans is the driving factor.
Yeah.
And you can see an outcome of it, but what you're starting off with has to morph and change and adapt, and
So I think
you just got to start.
You have to start, and you have to have this kind of dogged commitment. Yeah. And I'm not sure whether either of us thought we were going to be asked to make this commitment to education long term. We thought it was a thing that was going to be slightly easier, and then we'd move on to other things. What we've actually had to realize is that, and this is kind of the link to climate change as well, is that the school is a platform for intergenerational change, and it is replicable. And then through the impact that it can have on young leaders, we can indirectly support and approach other challenge areas that they are interested in, that they want to do something about. So ironically, the climate change that has moved these families, displaced them, will become apparent and of interest to the young people, but they'll want to do something about it. They won't want to be displaced by it.
Cool. Awesome.
So, it is both cause and effect in a way. It demonstrates my earlier point of if you don't get ahead of it, it's going to move people. It's going to take their power away. It's going to displace them. And then you might be lucky enough to actually the next generation will say, this far and no further. We're going to do the adaptation. We're going to do the change. So a lot of those young people are very, very passionate about sorting out sustainability. And it's difficult because there's real trade-offs all the way through this. So there are opportunities, like it's really difficult to plug these schools in for electricity. You have to, because you're relying on national infrastructure. But potentially, if we had the right investment, you could leapfrog and this school could be off-grid. So that would be good. If we had the money, you would just say, let's not bother with the old-fashioned ways of producing electricity and energy. Let's just go off-grid and actually share that energy with everybody in the community, for example. Let's have a microgrid. But also, one of the main sources of waste management in sub-Saharan Africa is just to burn it.
Oh, man.
So just as, I started by saying, from a UK perspective, people used to separate social from enterprise. These people have got a very intimate experience of climate change, and yet they are still burning waste because it is the only option. So you're constantly facing these contradictions in front of your face. And we just have the faith that actually it'll be a team of young people that actually see that issue and do something about it and turn it into a business. Yeah. And if they do that, we will back them and invest in them and support them to do it. And maybe you'll have a circular economy solution, a waste diversion solution come out. So you can't expect all of these issues to be solved. And that's the beauty of part of Emmanuel's mission is that we don't have to, because we've got this generation of young people that want to lead, that want to make a contribution. And so these challenges are their gifts.
Well, if you want to make any kind of long-term change, you should be educating the children.
Yeah.
You've made some really awesome observations and some really cool, there's a lot of cool insight into what Emmanuel's done in Nigeria. How do you see, what you're viewing over there? What comparisons can you make to New Zealand? What sort of organisations or corporations, entities, charities, whatever? I'm searching for comparisons. Like, what can New Zealand do that is socially innovative, that can be comparable to what you've seen in these situations?
Well, I think some of the challenges are similar. And I know that's difficult, and I'm not trying to be rude or disrespectful, but there's a lovely phrase: when it comes to equity and regenerative practices and a sustainable approach to living on this planet, we are all developing countries. So education, I think, is one of these unfortunate international universals that it doesn't work anywhere anymore very well. So, and I've seen that, and we've dealt with it. The education system in New Zealand, while it is good in pockets, it isn't an equitable system. And while it has potential, and it's not, it is not going to fall over completely tomorrow. There's still time. It needs to change to respond similar to this education system. Are you actually using it and deploying it to enable and empower young people to lead in the way that we'll need them to lead in the future?
Yeah.
Are they learning in the right ways, in the right environments, about the right things? And do they have enough agency and an opportunity within that learning to explore who they are and how to chart their own pathways into the future?
Cool. So
I don't see that. I see that as a challenge that we face right here where we're sat. And we're trying to deal with it here, and that's what they're dealing with there. So there's a similarity there. I think then again there is a call to action around how are we engaging the next generation of leaders? Is it a more transformational handover of one generation to another, where we're actually supporting them to benefit from the wisdom of older generations, but pick the right emerging markets, emerging economies, emerging technologies, or are we just trying to pack in the last generation into traditional jobs? And I think the thing that's similar is I think young people are starting to work it out for themselves that maybe they're not getting the advice that they should be, or the insight, and they're becoming more depressed and more negative about the future when at a time when they should be applying their creativity and positivity to say it'll be hard, but there are opportunities and I can pursue them.
Hey, Richard, I'm getting the thumbs up from the guys out there. Thank you for sharing your stories and coming to Tai Tokoro to be with us. Real pleasure as always. I'm going to have to get another time to talk.
Finish it off.
Well, yeah. So much more that you got inside that beautiful head of yours, mate. So yeah, that's a wrap from Climate Kōrero. Thank you, Richard. Whoever's watching, please like, subscribe, all that kind of thing. Leave comments, and also let us know what other topics we can touch upon. Kia ora.